Thanks for coming this morning. My name is John Kelsbeek. I'm the associate curator here at MAM, and helped Leslie work on the show.
A lot.
A couple of years ago, I think is when you first proposed it.
2 years ago, yeah.
So Leslie started the exhibit, as you might know, in 1995. There was a caravan project. She'll probably going to talk about that.
Slightly, yeah.
A group of artists traveled around the state of Montana and brought contemporary art exhibits to rural areas, so they boxed it up and traveled around. And Leslie made 5 boxes that she brought to Peepshows. That's when she originated the series. And then so a couple of years ago, she thought of it again and wanted to continue to work on it, and asked if we'd be interested. And we looked at the old works and thought, yeah, definitely. So a couple of years later, after a lot of work, Leslie, we've got 10 Peepshow boxes now. Just this past fall, MAM took the exhibit to MAGDA, the statewide arts organization group, and we offered it up to travel. So starting as soon as this show's over here, it'll travel around the state for a couple of years, go to a few different venues.
Which is really good.
We're excited about that.
Yeah. And John was very helpful because he's on the board there. So thank you.
It's no, it's just we just presented it. If there's interest from other museums and they order galleries, so they say yeah, we'll take it. So we're excited about that. That'll be for a couple of years after this show. It'll be out around the state for a while. So yeah, we're just really hopefully you've seen some of the boxes. If not, afterwards you can go take a look at them. We've put them around the building. We thought it'd be fun, kind of add to the discovery feel of it. As you know they're here, and then as you walk around, you happen upon them. And it's only been up for a month now, but I do hear people walk upstairs and go, oh, well, there's one there.
Yeah.
So just think they're really great. I mean, the paintings themselves, obviously Leslie is a super talented painter. The little gouache paintings are just magical, and when you turn the light on, it just seems to add some kind of it's a magical little, the metallic paint you use in just little areas. I just love it. So Leslie's got a big slideshow here for you, so I'm not going to talk about the work much. But
well, don't be scared. The slideshow's not that long. I'm from a generation where you'd mention slideshow and people would like sort of leave the room.
Right.
I mean,
there's no 100-disc carousels.
No.
All right. Thanks for coming. Thanks,
Yeah.
Leslie.
Thanks, John. Yeah. So I'm gonna give. I'll tell you the structure so you know what's going on. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the background of the series. And sort of bring you up to present time with it. And then I'm going to talk about the paintings themselves, which I haven't talked about with any. This is the third time I've discussed this whole event at the museum, but I'm going to talk about the actual gouache paintings and kind of how I was inspired to do those. Then I'm going to give you about a 15-minute slideshow about the production of the book, which is related to the series. And then at the conclusion of that, which will probably be in about 20 or 30 minutes, then we'll go and I'll talk to you. If you want to follow me around, since it's a small group, we could look at some of the peep shows, and I can tell you some of the interesting stories behind the subject matter, like the Jack Dempsey fight in Shelby, or Evelyn Cameron and Terry, or the Chapel of the Dove, which is like right at the top of the list for me now since it's Missoula. So that's what it's going to be. But this is very informal. I know almost all of you here, and I, if any of you want to ask me a question, please interrupt. It's not a big deal. It's not going to damage my train of thought. So, as John said, the original idea came to me in probably 1994 when I was able to be included. Catherine Mallory and Bobby are both veterans of the Caravan Project. And the Caravan Project was organized by our friend Renee Westbrook. We got NEA funding and WestHAF funding and Arts Council funding. We got a lot of funding, which when you divided it by 14 people, it really wasn't that much money, but it was a good stamp of approval for us to do portable art shows. That one of the most important criteria, which I really didn't think a whole lot about at the time, was that it was going to be shown for one day at each place outside. So we weren't in art centers, we weren't in buildings, and one of the fascinating things to me about my show this time is it's in a formal museum setting. So it feels very different to me to have these things not propped up in the grass or in a dirt lot outside of Fort Belknap. It's really it changes it. But in any case, we had to be able to have the stuff outside. And we went to about 14 places or 20, I don't know, we spent a month and a half in lots of different types of vehicles, driving around the state, and everybody was really creative about what they came up with. And for me, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I knew I wanted to do paintings. Well, you can't have a painting outside, you don't have walls, and I didn't have something to protect it. So I came up with the idea of putting these paintings inside of Peepshow boxes. And having lived in the state at that time about 20 years, I was really feeling my love and affection for the state. And so it was like, okay, well, I'm traveling around the state. Why wouldn't I do something that has to do with Montana history? And simultaneously, I had been obsessed with Queen Elizabeth I for about 3 or 4 years. And looking back on it, my daughter was a teenager at the time, so I couldn't press her into service. Now she's actually a tailor and does sewing all the time, and I could actually fulfill this. But back in the mid-90s, I wanted to dress up as Queen Elizabeth. I actually bought patterns of the appropriate clothing that she wore. And I realized it would probably cost me, at that time, it would have cost me well over $1,000 of both material and time, and then looking for the kind of right ingredients, because she had jewels all over her clothes. Anyway, I was really obsessed with her. I wanted to impersonate her, and I couldn't figure it out being in Missoula in the mid-90s. So when the caravan came up, I just went, oh, I'll have her in these paintings. She will actually visit these different places at different times, and it'll be a great excuse to research her more and actually depict her clothes. So everything that I did at that time was inspired by kind of major historical events like Clark and Sacagawea at Travelers Rest. And Evelyn Cameron, the book on her photography, had recently come out. So I was using books. I was going to Helena quite a bit, to the historical archives there, and really enjoying looking through the photographs of what they had in evidence. So I was using the photography and my imagination to fill things out. Anyway, the long and the short of it, we did it. It was an extraordinary experience. It was very arduous. You could ask these guys. It's kind of amazing we survived the experience, but we did. But the weird thing with my pieces is, even though people really like them, and especially children really, really like them, once they came back, because they're in boxes and I didn't want to sell them, they basically went into storage. So they have been like Sleeping Beauty for 20 years, and no one, including me, nobody saw them. I didn't want to put them into frames, because that would have defeated the purpose. And in a way, I'm lucky, because if they had been in frames, I would have been tempted to sell them. And this way, they were just sort of out of the running. And but in the meantime, when we were traveling, Steve Gluckert, whose show is upstairs in the main gallery, was one of the caravan artists. And he's a native Montanan, which I am not. And he started saying to me, he'd look at people were like, we were around each other all the time. He'd look at one and he'd be like, did you know the story about Governor Marr falling off the steamboat, and maybe he was drunk and maybe he was murdered? And I was like, no, I didn't know. I don't remember that. And do you know about Mary Fields, who's this black woman that had an outrageous history around Helena? And I was like, no, I don't know that. And he said, I really think you ought to continue with this series, and these, there's lots of fascinating stories that are not so obviously known as the big ones. Which was great, and I considered it, but the truth is those paintings the first 5 took me a year and a half to do. And this next 5, with a lot of interruptions from personal life, have taken me a year and a half. So they're incredibly time consuming, and I think it's like putting a harness on or something like that. I didn't want to jump right back into it, and they're not for sale, so they don't generate revenue. So they kind of went on the back burner. Fast forward, Steve Gluckert's the curator here. I knew he was getting ready to retire. And I didn't know what his time frame was, but I was like, wow, it'd be really nice to have that show while he's still the curator here, and to sort of honor his suggestion, because he really was the one that was most enthusiastic. And of course, he's long gone. He's been gone for about a year and a half. But in the meantime, I did talk to them, and I started working on the paintings. So this new group has much more to do with Missoula. And so 3 or 4 of them are set in Missoula, yeah, technically, and then one's in Arlee. But it was kind of an opportunity to do ones that were relevant to our area, because when we were traveling, it was almost like a funny kind of informal popularity contest. Like the one of Evelyn and Terry was really popular in eastern Montana. And people didn't really care about the one at Travelers Rest. And then we were in Great Falls, and they really liked the Shelby one. And it's like, wow, people really resonate with the ones that have personal relevance. So these ones, I still have 3 more I'd like to do, 2 of which are out of Missoula. They're like in the future, but these ones are more eccentric. So it's like the Chapel of the Dove and Teddy Roosevelt coming here, which should be a famous event, but people don't really talk about it. I didn't know that he came through twice in the early teens, and was just down the block. He was on one reason not to tear these older buildings down. And he was actually at that building that's at the corner of Broadway and Higgins on the southeast side, where Butterfly Herbs is and all that stuff. So I have a mixture, and I personally have a strong affection for R. Lee and have been out in that area since the early 70s and gone to the powwow since the early 70s. So the next to last painting I did is of the powwow. But by then I knew, I was like, okay, I'm going to do the grand entry, or I'm going to do the intertribal. And I went, are you insane? Are you insane? You have 6 months to work on every. So I simplified it and used one of the really charming concession stands and have 5 Native Americans out there instead of like an insane number. So I made, as I've gotten older and realized how much time they've taken, I've made some artistic decisions based on my stamina and the level of kind of arduous behavior I need to participate in. So that's it. So I'll tell you really quickly about the paintings themselves. Are gouache on paper, which is opaque watercolor, as opposed to regular watercolor, which is transparent. Transparent watercolor, the whole thing is that the brilliance of the white paper that you're painting on comes through. So you handle it very differently with gouache, which is my closest imitation to what traditional Persian and Indian miniature painting was probably done with some form of gouache, which is the pigment with a somewhat opaque binder. They say that there's white in everything, but I don't believe there's white paint in the black. But there's something that makes the paint opaque. And it's watercolor, and you can apply it to paper, which is really good. And because it's a very fine material, as opposed to something like casein or acrylic, you can get a very delicate line. Somebody came up to me last night and said, I'm trying to teach myself, can I varnish it? And I was like, oh my God, don't do that. I mean, it would change, the whole beauty of it is almost like a soft, powdery surface. And by putting them into these paintings in the peep shows with the light the way that it is, it hits up the metallics, which John referred to, but also the powdery, beautiful quality of the gouache just works really well. So you're not seeing the paper. And part of the reason they take so extremely long is that I'm putting 2 to 3 coats of paint everywhere. And some places have a little more. I don't want it to get so thick that it's a problem, like texture-wise, but I want it to really, truly be opaque. So, so anyway, my family lived in Iran when I was a kid, and so by the time I was 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, I was seeing Persian miniature painting. And I know even before we moved over there, I was very visually oriented. So being a kid and being on the street and in the bazaars and in people's homes that were collecting that stuff, I was exposed to it kind of informally, but it had a strong impression on me. And the characteristics I would say that I was attracted to are, they're generally fairly small. They usually tell a story. They're painted in a very flat fashion, so the sense of perspective is not the traditional Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci thing. It's like things move from the bottom to the top. Lots of attention to detail. They're not afraid of patterning, and they're beautifully rendered. I mean, they're incredibly gorgeous paintings. If you are in a major museum, oftentimes they at least have a small collection of them. But anyway, I saw those, and I just was attracted to it. So as I became an adult artist, I started wanting, especially when I realized that the Indians had worked very similarly because they were influenced by the Persians. They had a lot of Persian artists traveling to India, like in 1500 and 1600. They were desirable painters. So that tradition became its own Indian thing, but had a lot of similarities to the Persian. Seeing more and more of those paintings as a young adult, I mean, it wasn't systematic, but I was attracted to doing it. And I was in England, and I bought gouache, and probably in 74, 75, brought it back to Montana, and I basically have taught myself. So I'm pretty accomplished for what I'm doing. It was difficult at the time because if any of you were around in that period of time, that was not a popular style to work on. And so I'm just going to make one little statement. The hegemony in the art world was bigger is better, Oil was at the top of the list. Water media was down there. Anything decorative was frowned upon. Anything small, I mean, it was like there was this whole set of rules and regulations. So I did it because I loved it and I knew what I was doing, but it was a hard sell with the general public because and with the art world. It's like it wasn't considered significant. And luckily I just kind of forged ahead. And now, fast forward 30 or 40 years, and gouache is considered a significant medium. A lot of my artist friends who used oil paint because of that thing are sick from the oil paint, or they're avoiding the oil paint. Oil paints have a lot of toxic side effects, and gouache doesn't as long as you're not eating it. So I feel lucky that I did it, and the art world has expanded significantly. So what you can do is okay, and it doesn't matter if it's on paper or canvas, and so that's been to my advantage. But I'm really happy that I've developed it over that long time. So just to give you a little conclusion on it, I thought I'd show you so what I do is I have a whole lot of paints. I love to mix colors. I have lots of these porcelain, either plates or artist palettes. I work with a headgear. I wear contact lenses under the best of circumstances, but I also, when I'm really into it, I've got my reading glasses on and my headgear, which means that that's what I say when it's like putting on a harness. It's a lot. It's like a lot of concentration. So an hour spent doing the gouache is really a very intense hour, in my opinion. Oh, hi, come on in. So I just thought I'd show you this. Just to say how crude things are initially, I do a lot of pencil drawings at the beginning, and I do a fairly refined and exact pencil drawing. So I don't want to have something unusual going on suddenly in the thing, because I've got all this time invested. So the woman that helped me with the book, Kathy Paoli, any of you that are her friends can't tell her this, okay? As a surprise to her, because she put in a huge amount of time on my book, I'm doing a little painting as a thank you for her. So I'm just showing that this is like really crude, but I decided I wanted to do a picture of the Queen looking at the book with her, you know, like looking at it, and I went, okay, I was like, I'm not putting 100 hours into this painting, I can't do it. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna do it. Max said, how long, my husband, it's like, how much time are you gonna put in that painting? I said, well, I'm gonna put 5, and he's like, big joke. So I'm probably at 10 right now, but it's not done. I probably have about 3 hours left to do, but you can see, I just thought I'd show you. So I tape them to paper. And the fun thing I'm having this go round as opposed to 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was trying to be very accurate with the clothing, with Queen Elizabeth's clothing, which, yeah, it doesn't, it's good. Once I get the hair and everything out, and a pencil in her finger, it's gonna be good. I think is she left-handed?
Yes.
I got that wrong, and I'm like, I'm not changing arms. I'm like, it's too late. But in any case, yeah, it's a pretty elaborate process, and I listen to lots of books on CD and stuff like that. So I have fun up in my studio, but the equipment is very beautiful, and the good thing is with these paint palettes, I have to tell you, I have like 80 of them. And because I mix the colors, and what's really good is I could let this sit for 10 years, literally, dust it off, and add water and use it again. So it's really efficient. I don't run through a lot of paint because I'm kind of cautious, and I mean, mixing the paint takes a lot of time. So the more I can mix and just sort of get it done with, it's more efficient.
Excuse me, does it come in a powdered form?
No, it's little tubes, which seem expensive. They're like $10 to $20 depending on the color content. But honestly, I only have to reorder them like every 4 or 5 years. And if they dry out, if you're ambitious, you can reconstitute it. Yeah, and I can give more. I am teaching a little workshop in January on the Peepshows. The primary emphasis is going to be on creating the Peepshow with the painting, but I'll probably bring in my gouache and offer people an opportunity to use them if they want to, if you're interested. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the book really quickly. So the book was inspired by the series, and last year I was lucky that Laura Millen, who is the director here, who in her previous incarnation had an art bookstore in Seattle. And I knew that because I met Laura when she first moved here. So and we're not talking about a book about books about artists like arty books. So she came from that background, and she said to me, I think you could apply for this grant and do a book about the show. And I was like, really? And she's like, yeah, I encourage you to do it. And then it was like, not only that, but don't do a catalog about the show, do an arty book about the show. And I'm like, wow. And then it was lucky, she recommended Kathy Paoli, and she recommended Artcraft Printers in Billings to use, and especially Kathy was like genius because she's an extremely talented person. And I don't usually collaborate. I'm in my studio, I'm working by myself, and I think most artists are like that. So an opportunity to collaborate with someone who was respectful of my vision and that we didn't have ego problems. It was like she would make an idea, I would make an idea, we'd sort of come back together. So one of the brilliant things that happened in working with her is once we wanted to do this creative direction, originally I wanted to do like a Peepshow box that people would assemble and have cards of the paintings in it, and it became obvious it was going to be incredibly expensive and very complicated. So at some point, after meeting for weeks and weeks, she goes, well, you know, you could, because I said, maybe we just do a book. And she's like, well, we could drill a hole through the center of the book, and then you could use that as a primitive peep show, like look at these postcards you want to produce. And then she went away. She went away, and we had to make a decision, because I did get the grant, and I got a grant from the Prop Foundation and also the Arts Council. When she came back, I was like, okay, we're doing, that idea is brilliant, we're gonna do that, and then you'll have the text, you know. And she's like, no, we're gonna do, she wanted to do the box. And I was like, you had this great idea, we are doing this. It was more work, I have to say, it was quite a bit more work, but we did that, and so we sort of went back and forth, and then there's a sleeve on the inside of the back cover. A couple of you people may have seen the books, but and then I was able to indulge my interest in paper dolls. So I'm going to show you the slideshow about the book production. Does anybody have any questions to date?
I do. How many total paintings are there? There were 5 originally, and then
5 new ones. But what happened is of the 5 original, we ended in like August of '95, and the art auction was coming up as a fundraiser, and I decided to paint a painting for the art auction. So I did the painting, the only painting that's in a frame in the lobby is of Jack Dempsey and Tommy Gibbons shaking hands with Queen Elizabeth in the ring with them. And that went into the auction, and Sharon Alexander purchased it, and then she's kindly loaned it to the exhibit. But it's the only one. And nobody really knew that at the time, because you know, people didn't really get it, and she's really happy she has it now. So it's sort of odd. I mean, I could put it in a Peep Show box if she wanted me to, but then she wouldn't be able to see it under normal circumstances.
so there are 10 total.
So there's 10, and I would like to do the 3. I do really have 3 more I would like to do. Yeah. What'd you say?
Trixie.
Trixie. Well, Trixie would be good. No, I mean,
really
so
want
that.
you to do
Well, I'd like to do one of the Caravan Project. I was like, oh my God. I mean, that would be so much fun. And so the good thing about the book is, and I encourage you to look, there's some samples upstairs. The book, there's 2 essays. The first essay is about the Caravan Project, and it was written by Renee Westbrook. And you know, it is in the context of my Peep Show, so it's mostly that, but it does talk about what the caravan was and who was in it. There's a really great group photo that's in the book. Because I don't think there's any documentation. I mean, it's kind of like this great thing that happened 20 years ago, and we didn't get a whole lot of publicity at the time. We got a little bit, but it's sort of like it's gone. And so that was one of the goals I had with the book, is to say, this really did happen. There were a lot of talented people involved, and it inspired me. So you guys, I don't know whether you've seen it, but there is a nice, that photo that Alain took. Yeah.
Will you be signing books today?
I will be signing books if you can wait for your ink to dry. Okay, so, and this is really, I did this for the book Festival of the Book. That's when we first got the books. So it was more for like a book crowd, but anyway, so that's the name of the book is, and we said the first Queen Elizabeth, because if it said the Queen Elizabeth the First, it got kind of wordy, so. And I just wanted to say, so I applied for the grant in May. It took a long time to kind of get bids and figure out that we were going to go from the box to a booklet. And so by the time we all got together to work on it, I only literally had like 5 weeks. So I was working on a painting that's upstairs in the lobby that's about the Chapel of the Dove. In my studio, that's the painting in the back corner there. And then I'm just showing you I rotate, and that's what my studio upstairs in the It's in a tower. It's like 10 by 10. It's really congested, but it's very good. So my computer was much more important than I would have liked it to have been, because I had to do a lot of stuff on the computer for the photography and the writing. But I was just showing, so this is where I took that painting and turned it to the wall and just went, I can't do it now. And then I had lucky interactions with Kathy. Kathy, this is at her office downtown. Her professional business is Inkstone. And she's just really, really competent. I think Ms. was lucky to have her here. So what I would do is, okay, what are we doing? And she's like, okay, you're going to write a 5-page essay. So she had a lot of input. And when we had this time frame, so I had like a countdown of what I needed to do. It was making me very nervous. John knows that. And then what it came, this is sort of like jumping ahead, but what came out with the book is that we had 16 pages with a lot of color illustrations, which I was really excited about. She said, look, why don't you do an essay about gouache, not just about the peep shows, but an essay about gouache, and put the peep shows in the context of your interest of gouache, which meant that I was able to pull photographs of paintings that I had done over the past 30 years, which was kind of nice documentation for me on an art level. And then we had an introduction, a very kind introduction from Brandon and John here at the museum, and 2 essays, which was my essay about gouache and Renee's essay about the caravan. Then we had the 3/8-inch peephole running through the entire book, which she had to, that's what took Kathy a lot of extra time, is she was typesetting it so that there were columns on the right and the left, and she left room for the peephole. And especially with the artwork, that there wasn't an image, although we did a few where it was like well orchestrated, but basically, I mean, she had a lot more layout challenges. Then we put sleeves on the inside back cover, which held postcards of the paintings. And then I got inspired by my daughter and her friend Helen Belangi had loved making paper dolls when they were kids, so I decided to make a paper doll of Queen Elizabeth, and that's like an oversized postcard that's freestanding in the book. So any of these postcards, like if you get bored with the book, you could always mail things to people, which I like. I like that. It's like you don't have to leave it that way. And it's 700, and I have signed each one. And the you know, the sort of gimmicky aspect of the whole thing is that the book functions as a peep show, a primitive, it gives this sense of a peep show. In any case, this is from the Caravan Project originally. This was Kathleen's sister, one of the artist's sister came with us quite a bit, and so she's outside of my tent looking at one of the boxes. And then this is here now. This is a box down in the lobby, and a woman's demonstrating it. And then this is kind of what it simulates what the effect of looking through the peephole is. So I wanted to really honor that effect with the book. So basically the computer, I'm showing the picture of the computer because I had to use the computer to start writing my essays and to start looking at all these slides of artwork. One of the disadvantages of your work, covering work that was done 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago is everything's on slide. And to go from slide to something that you can actually use, I mean, it turned out that with Artcraft in Billings, one of the biggest challenges is they've got, not just with me, but anybody that's doing something that's based on older work, you have images from slides, you have images from photographs, you have images from digital photographs, and all these things have to sort of look right in a book, but they're all coming from different sources. So that was actually very challenging. And then I was showing this with my desk. I was doing a painting, which I'll show you in a second, for the cover. This was at Kathy's suggestion. We were like, okay, what's the cover going to look like? Well, why don't we make it look like a theater? And so I was like, okay, I'll paint curtains, and then I'm going to have the Queen paint it separately. And then this is like going through it took me like 5 or 6 days to go through photo collection. And then I badgered my youngest sister in New Jersey into taking a photograph of one of the paintings that our family owns that was from Iran, which was very challenging for her to do because it was complicated. She had to photograph through the glass. But all this stuff kind of contributed to the visual aspect of the book. And then I started working on the Queen. And Kathy said, you need to work bigger than the cover. So the image, you know, if the image of the Queen on the cover is 7 inches or something like that, or 6.5, she said you work bigger and then you go smaller. And I knew that the art auction was coming up at the museum, and I knew I did not have more than 2 seconds to turn around and try and do an independent piece for the art auction. So I thought it was very clever. I went, I'm going to do the painting of the Queen on a big piece of paper, send it to them with strict instructions not to get greasy fingerprints on it, tell them to send it back to me, and then knock out a background. So I'll show at the very end I managed to do that. But there's the Queen evolving, and then I put her upside down to see what she looked like. And then that was kind of what we sent to Billings, so they scanned it directly in, so the quality of reproduction is very good because it was a direct scan. And then this was the curtains, and that was my cat, like trying to be very good so she'd be allowed to be on the table. And so Kathy gave me directions, like, okay, let's put your name below those footlights. So, you know, some of that stuff was planned. And then I really wanted to put directions on how to make your own little home theater. It was important to me, and so I deliberately made a little theater and put an image from the painting in it so that I could have it accompany the instructions on how to make one. That's the last page of the book. Because I'm really, as the caravan artist would tell you, I mean, appealing to children, and a lot of the people, I haven't mentioned this before, a lot of the artists on the caravan project were educators, and they worked with children or teenagers or college students. And so that aspect of having some instruction, so it's not just me, but like, hey, it's versatile, you can do your own book. So I talked to the printer because I was very anxious about the printing job, and he was kind enough to photograph things in process. This one actually is like an action scene. That was the cover coming off the press. And then this was some kind of a weird thing that read it. I don't know what. He was having fun because usually people don't ask for information on their print jobs. And then that was one of the sheets. And then he mailed them to me. And I have to say it was very challenging because the book, even though it's a book, and I'm definitely paying for it, it was a little more delicate and demanding than, it was more high maintenance than I think any of us realized. So we ended up having to reprint it to accommodate some issues that happened during the printing. But we ended up with a good result. And this was at the book festival, which was at the end of September. We had a really good turnout of people that came to see the books, and I signed books at that time. And then my mom went over to the book fair. I sold a few more books there. It was really cute. She helped me a lot with the show and with the book itself. She came up with a brilliant idea on the book that actually had a profound effect on our plans, which is really good when you're 85 and you can give direction in a field that you're not familiar with to some people that are like struggling through this. I appreciated her help. And then I just want to thank the Prop Foundation and the Arts Council for the support they did, because honestly I would have never ever considered this if I had not received that grant, because I would have just focused on the actual Peepshow paintings. But what we're finding is that there's some people that are really responding to the book. I was gratified last night. One of the people that came is a docent over at the Museum of Art and Culture. And she said she was there this week, and some docents that have been working with this museum came over there. And there was two women, and they had come from this show, and they couldn't get over the book. They were telling her she had to go to the museum, she had to see the book. And she's like, wow, I actually know Leslie. And they're like, it's really remarkable. And I'm not trying to brag, but it's like, it's really gratifying as an artist when those, I mean, I read when I was in my 30s that Freud said that artists wanted fame, fortune, and beautiful lovers. And he was talking about male artists, and I was like, well, that doesn't sound too bad. I'll take all three. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, I'm at an age where the fame isn't happening, the fortune is kind of questionable, and the beautiful lovers is kind of a thing of a past. So it's like, what do you want? What do you want when you make this kind of big effort? Well, what I want is people to connect with the work. So I feel really fortunate that the book seems to be complementary to the show, and maybe what Laura was saying is it will go further. So the peep shows, after the tour, they're probably going to go back into a storage facility, depending on what happens. And so the book has a life beyond that. And I think that's one of the beauties of literature, and the writing community has that as an advantage, that they can, much more easily than visual artists, they can get their work out into the world. So I'm actually going to write the British Museum, and the Victoria and Albert.
Oh, yeah.
And Hampton Court, and just see, because a woman came through last night. I'd been thinking about that, and a woman that has lived in England came through last night, and she's like, oh my God, you should be selling these in England. And I said, well, it seemed like they would be interested in imagery having to do with Queen Elizabeth. She said, no, they love Montana. And she said the connection between Liz, and she said, I think they're going to really get it. She's like, oh, you should go for it. So I don't know. I mean, they're a very small addition to try and do something like that with, but it's encouraging. So I wanted to end the slideshow with, this is the painting I submitted to the auction. So I was at Holland Lake in September with a girlfriend that I go camping with, and I had her pose with her dog on the hiking trail, and it's like, I need to put Queen, and I was like, I don't have any time to waste. You stand there and I'll sketch it and photograph it. So it was good when I got the painting back from the printer. I just knocked it out. I had to. And the colors are better than they appear here. But that's the slideshow. So if you have questions, this might be a good time to answer them. And then otherwise, we can go, and if you want to, I'll tell you about a few of the paintings. Yes, John?
So, my burning question, I'm a fan of Carol, your mom.
Yeah.
I felt teased. You said she had a good idea.
Okay, so this is, so I'm going to be totally honest. My mother is extremely intelligent. She has a hearing problem, and my sister can confirm it. So even though she's intelligent, if you don't make a huge effort, because she refuses to, or at least at that point, refused to wear hearing aids. So she gets told information by the family, but it's an effort to like go into anything complex, you know. So it's more like, okay, we're going to dinner, or how are you feeling, but not, you know, this is why I've decided to do this, and this essay is a little strange, you know. But I pat myself on the back. I am going to engage her. I'm going to tell her. So I was like forcing her. She's not conservative, but this was kind of out there. And I'm like, okay, you're going to read this essay. I want you to read this essay and tell me what you think. And the book's going to have a hole in the middle. I mean, I was involving her. She's like, well, that's a little different, you know? So at one point I had her at the studio, and I had my essay, Renee's essay, sort of a prototype. And she reads through it, and this was before we print it. And she goes, well, you know, that's okay. I think some people will probably like it, but you don't know what you're supposed to do with it. There's no instructions about why is the peephole there? It doesn't tell you anything. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. I mean, it's like, I was like, spell it out. And I called Kathy, and I'm like, red alert. My mom's got a brilliant point. It's like, people are going to, why is this hole? And so Kathy extricated part of Renee's essay. Renee wrote something charming about how peep shows were with a certain era, which was certainly true in the 70s and 80s, like scantily clad women is what they had degenerated into. So Renee had a great little quote. So Kathy pasted that on the back, and then talks about that you hold up the book and look at this stuff. So it sounds minor, but it was critical. It was really critical. And I'm going, you know, thank God my mom's, you know, that I persevered with her, and then she rewarded me by giving me, we wouldn't have caught it. We wouldn't have caught it. And I think the appeal of the book, it would have been considerably diminished. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Leslie, you talked about the beginning, the extreme difference of having the peep shows in sort of the caravan setting versus the formal setting of a museum.
Yeah.
And I'd just be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that, like the differences.
Well, the funny thing is, so really I hadn't looked at them for a long time. They were in the basement of the Brunswick. So they come out, they're covered with cobwebs and dirt. The paintings weren't. I had stored the paintings separately. But they come out, they're sort of beat up, because we finished the caravan and I just put them away. So then, and I was preoccupied with the book and with finishing the painting, so I wasn't really thinking too much about them. I'm like, okay, those 5 are done. I need to do 5 new ones. So I wasn't giving them much credibility. And everything was very rushed because I was so far behind schedule. The book really took an extra 2 months, basically. So by the time they had to come into the museum, it was like, wipe them down. I had my poor mom in there like, okay, scrub that down, get that dirt off of it, okay? So we scrub them down, we get the new ones sort of painted, we bring them in, and then all of a sudden, they look like sculpture. I think that what I had thought before is they were just a vehicle for you being able to look at the work. And all of a sudden, I'm going, wow, I actually was worried they'd look sort of goofy. And then I'm seeing them here and I'm going, I think they look cool. I mean, maybe it's just a personal prejudice, but especially if the paint, like I've gone back and repainted some of the original ones because they were a little beat up. So with a fresh coat of paint, and it's a reminder that you take something into it. I mean, before, we were setting up on uneven ground, and there was like windstorms and a very infamous rainstorm, hailstorm, which is quoted. Renee talks about that in the book. I mean, so it was a lot different, and they were in the tent, so you were like sort of enclosed. So having space around them, and again, I have to give you a little thing. So the best part about being here last night is that for 2 years, all I've been doing is working in my studio, hardly seeing good friends at all, as a number of you know. I've just like been sort of out of commission. So I'm working and I'm going, is anybody going to care about these? Do these mean anything? Are they as good as the last ones? I mean, like I didn't have any of those questions answered. So being here last night, I had a number of people that volunteered interactions, and that was one of them, is that they like the way that they look. They like the way that they can come up. And some of that stuff was told to me when we were traveling 20 years ago. But I think having them dispersed and having the batteries, the big difference is when I did it 20 years ago, my dad came up with this ingenious idea of stringing. They have brake lights inside of them, and then they were wired to one gigantic battery on the ground that we had cords going around. And I was able to do that because I was right there, and I made sure people didn't trip over them, and they all worked fine. But we wanted to not have these wed to the wall and not clustered together. So we came up with putting rechargeable batteries inside of each one, which actually creates a lot of issues itself. But they're a lot cleaner. For that reason, they don't have wires coming out. They're not inside of the thing. So it was kind of a surprise to realize that was an extra dimension that I didn't anticipate. I mean, I don't know, have you looked at them?
Oh, yeah. And I would say I would agree with that during the caravan, I didn't look at them so much as sculpture.
Yeah.
It was just more of a vehicle to see the painting, where here in the clean sort of white cube setting of the museum, they really do become more of an object.
Yeah.
And so I was just curious if...
Well, it's a pleasant surprise, because that never even crossed my mind. It was more like, okay, they're just something to do that. And I want to say, my dad, it's a little tribute to my father. My father is a chemical engineer, most of you know that. And he had retired, fairly recently retired. I think he was about my age when I started doing the caravan. And the arrogance of my youth is like, I need a way to light these damn things up, and my dad's going to be the one that figures it out. But I just assumed he would figure it out. So he died last year, and now I'm going, okay, I have to bring this up to date, and I'm not using the big, it's like I really miss my father, and I'm like, he was a lot more brilliant that I gave credit to him for, because it just seemed, he did it so easily. But the truth is, going to talk to the electricians and Napa car parts and Pratt Electric, and they're like, oh my God. And I'm like, yeah, and so I'm like, I'm relying on you because my father is not here. So how do we solve this problem? And they were really good, but it pointed out that I think that we probably do that with our parents a lot. Yeah, but it was a good, so they're kind of like little primitive machines. So I guess the last thing I want to say is that the kids that have come through, and last night I had a friend who was coming down, and she has a 11-year-old daughter, and they said, the parents said to the daughter, would you like to come down? Leslie's got an art show. And she said, oh, the peep shows? And the mom said, yeah. And she said, oh, I have seen them. You're in for a treat. and she's like, and do you know they do that? And she it was Vivi, listed all the attributes. And I was like, okay, that's kind of exciting to me. If you've got a 10 or 11-year-old kid urging their parents to go down and see it, And I heard that pretty repeatedly. So I don't know if, yeah, do you have
One quick question. So are there just 700 copies of the book?
There's only 700, and the truth is probably by the time I sign them, there's going to be 650, because I'm being pretty rigorous about screening them. Yeah. I'm looking through each one because of potential printing, like minor printing flaws and stuff like that. Why?
Well, I'm just wondering, because you're talking about these different venues where you might be able.
I know, it's funny, because originally I was going to do 300. That was the amount that the grant covered, and then I went, okay, I'll do 500. And once you get it gets cheaper and cheaper. And finally I was like, I'm doing 700, and my husband and Laura are both like, you're going to have those under your bed for the rest of your life. So I had gone down to 500, and then we had to reprint the first one. And I went, screw it, I'm paying an extra $200 for these extra two. And it's like,
Well,
then
they're
I can be, that's it. And I went, I'd like to be able to be generous. So it is going to travel, and I guess when it travels, then I can give 10 to each venue as a thank you. I gave one to each of the staff members here. I'm going to give one to each of the board members. And if I was starting to feel like precious about it, I wouldn't do that. So I'm just going, and I'm appreciative that anybody wants to look at it. So I'd like some revenue, and I'm splitting the revenue with the museum. So it's a nice way, and those traveling sites will make a little money from them if people buy them. And the woman that said, oh, you should be selling these at the Victoria and Albert, I said, well, the problem is it's a small edition. And she said, if the Victoria and Albert said they were interested, you could reprint.
Right.
Yeah.
I said, well, you might, that might be right. Yeah.
It's kind of an aesthetics question, and maybe it's not, I'd be interested in hearing what others might have to say, because this gets into the difference between artist and audience or viewing art. And I appreciated the snippets in the book about the Peepshow.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it is a big deal when you start contrasting. Generally, we're looking at art in perhaps a gallery setting. We're aware that other people that there's a viewership which is multiple people, and the Peepshow is very much an individualized experience.
Mm-hmm.
And as the essay makes, in some ways it is a prurient experience.
What does prurient mean?
Salacious.
Overtones of,
Of like the peep shows in New York.
I mean,
Yeah.
almost, if I
Yeah.
can say this, a masturbatory experience in that it's quite solitary,
Yeah.
and it's sort of keeping the rest of the world out, and with some of the negative effects of that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Oh
what
no,
sort
I'm
of feedback have you been
well thank.
That's sort of my question.
Yeah.
And how is it for viewers?
Well, so
Which
this
is a big part of art.
Yeah, so this is exciting, and I'm glad John asked this question because I did address it last night, and Steve Gluckert contributed quite a bit to it. So the deal is, I came up with this. I wasn't saying I want people to have this interaction. It was a practical solution. I wanted this delicate art to be transported around in these kind of semi-hostile environments. But when I'm realizing, just like the sculptural aspect of the boxes, is that what I'm thrilled about, and I have to tell you, like, the disclaimer is, I am a person that paints. My work usually goes in a frame with glass in front of it, just like anybody else in the, that's the standard presentation of flat work, okay? But what I've discovered with the peep shows, and I have to say, I've been doing art for 40 years. I've never seen people so excited about my work. There is a buzz around it right now. And I think it is because we're increasingly at computers, we're at digital media, internet media, flat screen. You can stay in your house, you don't have to actually go out and interact with people or with art or anything. And the peep shows demand that you not only come to the museum, but you're going to have to walk up there, you're going to have to look at it, you're going to flip a switch. There's like a commitment from the viewer. Plus, at the same time, over the past 20 years, we're more and more inundated with tons of bombardment of both positive and a lot of very negative imagery in our everyday environment, noise and sound, and there's a lot more humans than there used to be. So there's like this, to get through that, you have to be really loud or really crude or extreme. And I think that peep shows, I think that part of what Vivi was talking about is, wow, I had this little world, like you're going into a world. So instead of prurient, which I did have to battle that 20 years ago. A lot of the people that came to the Caravan and would look at them initially like, oh, is this a girly show? And I haven't had one person say that now. So I feel we sort of moved, in the 20 years, that has changed. Because really, when I was living in the New York area off and on in the 60s and 70s, those peep shows still existed in New York, and there was that one area, Times Square, you would go down there, it was really nasty. And I was like, so when people said that 20 years ago, I was like, Jesus Christ, I don't want people to imagine that's what this is. This is not that kind of experience. So luckily, I'm not really having to answer those questions now. And so it doesn't feel so much like a lewd sexual act. It's like people take respite in it. And what I was saying last night is that with the awful political stuff that has been going on across the board, nationally and internationally, it's just like a horrible slew of things that you want to sort of turn your back on and imagine aren't happening. And so the function of art, to me, the best function of art, is that it creates a place where you can be reminded of the best of being a human. And so if by coming down here and like blocking out all the kind of nonsense and being able to look through a little hole for 10 seconds or 5 seconds or 2 seconds and see something that maybe captures your imagination, please, I think it's important, and it's trying to remind. And so that's why I'm really happy that the kids seem to be connecting with it, because I think the kids are particularly at risk with all the kind of crazy stuff that's going on. So Max had to come down. One of the Peeps boxes, John can tell you, they've been having a lot of technical issues because of the rechargeable batteries and the switches. And so Max was down here at closing time about 2 weeks ago, and he had to take the back off to revamp something inside. And there was an art class here that was letting out. And Max likes children, but he's not like a bit warm, fuzzy guy. He's not like, he would never volunteer to go to a nursery class or anything. So he's up there working. He comes back and he's like, I had the best experience at the museum. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, because it's been a big headache for him. And he's like, I did. And I said, what happened? He said, well, I took off the back of the thing. I was working on it because it was closing hours, but this class was letting out. And he said, this group of kids came up and they were fascinated. So they're asking him questions. They want to see how the light works. They want to see how the switch works. They want to see the painting. He dismantles it. He lets them try it. And then he's about to conclude and he goes, yeah, and then this 11-year-old boy went up and bought one of the books. And I was like, you gotta be joking. It's like, really? It's like, who has a $20 bill at age? And he's like, well, times have changed. But I was like, that's, so I don't know. I think it's like, I mean, people like them when we toured 20 years ago, but the level of enthusiasm seems bigger. And I think it's partly because they're unusual. They do require a commitment. And I think art that really engages the viewer that way has an advantage. So Steve's work upstairs has a lot of those elements. You can turn a machine or you can whatever. And I just remember from when I was younger, a lot of the art that made big, strong impression, like tactile impressions on me, was stuff that protruded from the wall or that you moved or some kind of kinetic aspect. Does that answer your question? No, I mean, go ahead if you.
Well, others could probably answer it as well as you, because
Uh-huh.
I was actually talking about a viewer's thing.
Yeah.
What's up?
What I
Bob?
think's so interesting for me on the caravan, just looking at them, every time I thought, oh my God, there she is, the queen. And with that, for me, came all of this political and moral. Like, we live with all of that those constraints that came from the European traditions. And so then to have these things in Peepshow boxes, I just thought it just all fit so well, because there's that kind of naughty thing that we're doing, but we're actually looking at Queen Elizabeth at the Dempsey fight artwork. And that's what I love them conceptually for that reason. Not sculpturally, but I just love that they're like that. They're like this naughty thing that comes from that weird tradition. Yeah. So, anyway.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. So when we were working on the book, and I knew that in some way we had to refer to the peep shows. So luckily, Renee took that on in her essay, but I wasn't sure. I mean, when I was researching how to write the directions for my little theater, so I sort of got engrossed in it. But they really are pretty cool. They were originally more like what I was doing. So they were these little wooden boxes that either had light coming from the outside above that would shine on the inside, or they had candles inside and maybe like little curtains, but they have a few in museums. And what's really kind of coincidental is one of our brothers is in England right now, and the other brother's visiting them. him. And so my brother Paul sent me an email. He knew about the show, but he didn't know I was talking today. He sent me an email from the Victoria and Albert of a peep show from 1730 or 1740. If I'd had time, I would have incorporated it here. But it shows the painting, and then it shows the box, and the box is not worlds apart from mine. And I never, 20 years ago, I never saw any of this stuff because I didn't have internet access. So I know what you're talking about. But for some reason, I'm more into the like telling the story, or there's a narrative that's unfolding in this kind of private fashion.
So the other thing I was thinking about with the peep show boxes themselves becoming more sculptural. I don't know. For some
Catherine's a
reason,
sculptor.
one of the first things that I thought of with the Evelyn Cameron one was, wow, what if this box itself looked like
Well,
a
it's-
4x5
Oh,
camera? I mean, so like who knows if you would ever want to push that aspect of it even further, like make the box even more sculptural. Yeah, I mean.
Well, it's interesting because when I used to think about doing the show like 5 years ago, and I've been entertaining it for a while, but I thought, oh, I'm going to pull out the box, never knowing I'd have so little time. I'll pull out the old boxes and I'm going to decorate them. I was going to put like stars or sort of magical symbol, like alchemical symbols all over it. And then when I was like, forget it, there's no way on earth. I'm not complicating this at all. But when I was picking out the colors for the new boxes, one of them is black, which I don't think I would have done 20 years ago. But Max was like, it's okay to do. He didn't want me to use like circus colors. He was really, and I was like, I'll listen to him in this instance. But I did one that was black, which seemed very somber. But it's cool because it looks more like what you're talking about. And it emphasized that sculptural quality. So
Yeah, and just sort of that aspect of looking through a viewfinder, like the cameras were, and yeah. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. That who knows if you'd ever want to even
push
that
it even more.
aspect
Well, that's it. I think if I did this, I'd wait another 5 or 10 years. But if I did it again, I can build on my comprehension of how this was done.
Don't wait too long.
I know. Well, it's funny. I was like, these might go into storage for another 20 years, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know about that. So, does anybody want to come upstairs with me? Or what time is it? 12:03. It's been an hour, so I'm happy if you want to go in the lobby. I could tell, but if you need to go,
I
please.
wanna go get a book.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and
wanna go buy
I have to warn you that if I sign the book, sometimes the ink takes 10 minutes to dry before you can, just to let you know, okay? Because I don't want it to smear. That's part of why I don't have 700 books, because some of them have been called. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. Yeah. So the first Peep Show, which is the most important painting that I did, is the one that sets the tone, which is, and the premise that Queen Elizabeth I had in real life a alchemist that she worked with named Dr. D. And he did things like, trying to change base metals into gold, and had all sorts of, he had a laboratory, he spent time in Germany, he sort of did all this stuff, but he's a recognized historical figure that was in her court. So I postulated that he was the one that made a time machine for her, because she was very curious about all these explorations that she funded with the Navy and with the seafaring vessels. So, she wasn't able to do that, but in her privacy, she could enter a time chamber. So this very first one shows the Queen in a time chamber, accompanied by one of her, she surrounded herself with handsome adventurers. She never married, so she had a lot of favorites. Anyway, this is her, Walter Raleigh, standing beside her as she enters the time machine. And if you look at the painting closely, you'll see that it shows an image of the Earth, and then an image of Montana in the United States and North America, and then more specifically Montana. So it's like showing where she's heading. So that's what she's going to do. Every time she comes to Montana, she has entered the time chamber. And this one, I color coded them so it would be easy to kind of keep track of who is what. But this one, we're jumping around in time. This is in the 1950s, and she's visiting Jeanette Rankin. And Jeanette Rankin was a political figure who went to Washington, and she was really important because it was a time when women were not in the government that way as elected officials. Anyway, she retired, and she spent time in Montana and other places, but she obviously liked having lunch at the Broadwater Hotel in Helena. There's actually photographic documentation of her at the tables there, so I had it so that the Queen was able to visit her in this 1950s setting and presumably had a cup of tea with her. So there's actually a reference to this painting in the little booklet we were talking about earlier. This peep show is Evelyn Cameron, who was a British woman who moved to Montana, eastern Montana, at the end of the 19th century, and homesteaded with her husband. And she became a really important figure, not at the time she was living so much, but in retrospect, because she took glass plate photographs of the life that surrounded her at that time, including people in the agrarian circumstances and women and children and festivals like July 4th. And I used a photograph she had taken of an immigrant woman sitting on the stoop of her very modest house in the field. And I put Queen Elizabeth next to that woman, and then I put Evelyn in the foreground. So if you look through this, that's what you would see. But this is an important one because it reminds us that in order to look inside of the box, and the inside of the box is completely black. And then, so the only thing you're going to see is the paintings, and the paintings are attached to a panel in the back of the box. So I have removed this painting from its box because each of the peep shows has an independent battery that has to be recharged. It's a rechargeable battery that activates a really powerful light. When you do this, it turns that light on and then it goes off. And we're finding that about once a week, these batteries need to be recharged. And in order to access the batteries, I'm taking the paintings off of the back of the box. So that's it. But anyway, so that's Evelyn Cameron. And then the paintings that I've done in the past 2 years have mostly been inspired by the Missoula area and stories and incidents that occurred there. And this is the Chapel of the Dove, which was formulated in the basement of the Wilma building in the 1980s by a man named Ed Sharp. He was very eccentric, and he had kind of a vision. So when you paid your money to go see a movie in the Chapel of the Dove, and it was usually a foreign movie, you not only got to see the movie, but you were subjected, whether you wanted to be or not, you were subjected to this really pretty fabulous environment which no longer exists. He died, the building got sold, the Chapel of the Dove was disbanded. It's probably part of a restaurant right now. But I was lucky enough to find archival photos of the interior of the theater. And my husband and my daughter and some friends of mine, we would go see movies there. So I went ahead and put the Queen in a row at the theater along with myself and my husband and my daughter and my friend Suzanne. And then some other friends, the man that runs the Roxy Theater now, spent some time here and visited the Chapel of the Dove with his friend Steve. So they're friends of mine. So I was lucky to say, oh, okay, well, the Queen was there and we were too. But it's kind of fun because I was able to analyze all the components of what that guy put together to create this environment, which I don't think he would have called himself an artist, but being an artist, now that I look at it, he was an artist. It just wasn't part of his framework of how he viewed himself, but it's worth documenting. And so that's kind of an example of how the paintings are allowing me, especially the most recent group, I'm sort of going, all history is important, and not just the big events like the wars or the political events or the stuff that's going to make frontline news, but the little things are very important too, especially the things that affect people in the everyday life. So this has been an example of reminding people that that existed, and it was pretty outrageous. And Mr. Sharp did not receive as much attention. He did get some attention. I mean, now I'm finding out just from my kind of research, there were articles written about him at the time, but I'm sort of excavating some of that level of personal or local history that I think is really culturally rich. So, and in that vein, this is another one of the more recent peep shows, and it's the Ardley Powwow, and I've been going to the Ardley Powwow since the early 70s, not every year, but every few years, because I've had an affiliation with the Jocko Valley and Ardley too, and I've been very attracted to the Native American culture in that area and very respectful of it. So it was an opportunity for me to say, okay, this again is a local event, very, very rich visually and musically and culturally, that I want to recognize. So Queen Elizabeth is very happy to have visited. I kind of cheated because there's a situation in most of the powwows I've seen, especially in the Ardley powwow, and they're called the grand entry, which is where all the tribal members, even if they're later going to dance in very specific dances that are maybe limited to certain ages or sexes or whatever, in the grand entry, everybody that's there will come. And then there's also a dance called the intertribal, which again, it brings everybody, which means that it could be several hundred dancers. And I have photographs of the intertribal, so I was originally going to have Elizabeth viewing an intertribal, and then I realized that I would probably spend 4 to 5 months doing that painting. It would have been incredibly time consuming, because the truth is, the more I looked at the material I had, the level of detail that they employ in their clothing, and not just the clothing but also the accessories, like what they're holding in their hands and what their footgear is and their headgear and their shawls and all that stuff. Individually, I would have just gone crazy. So I decided I had some good photos of the concession stands that tend to travel around to these powwows. And one I really liked, I thought it was very charmingly decorated. It's called the Sugar Shack. So the Sugar Shack not only was at the Salish powwow, which takes place in Ardley, but also I've seen it up at the Kootenai powwow, which happens up on the west side of Flathead Lake. So I decided I would have her getting a snow cone along with a Native American dancer and young woman, and then some women that are in traditional gear that are walking in the foreground. So it still took me about 140 hours, but I wasn't looking at a 500-hour painting, which would have just blown my gasket. So, but and I'm fond of it. I love Ardley, and I love that. I just like the atmosphere there. So I think I've captured that in the painting. I'm very pleased with it. And I've found that people are responding to it pretty well. And I think, again, it's because it's local and people appreciate the connection with the Native American community. It's set in the most recent period, and I have several photos of the Sugar Shack, both from the Ardley powwow and the Elmo powwow. And I realized that I could have said it was in 2010 or 2011 or, sometime recently. So I just kind of picked a date, but it's the most recent manifestation of her visits. What I've found is that I did 5 paintings 20 years ago, and at that time I'd been in the state about 20 years. And now the newer 5 paintings, I've been in the state over 4 decades. And so my experience of being a Montanan and sort of understanding where I'm living, certainly it was pretty good after 20 years, but it's even more developed now. So the paintings from 5 years ago, or 20 years ago, were inspired by historical events like Lewis and Clark's visit, the Voyage of Discovery. That was going on. There was a big celebration when I was doing the paintings in the mid-90s. And Evelyn Cameron, there had been a book about her, so they were kind of recognizably important figures. But I think I've referred to that in my talk with the group of people, that it was an opportunity on the caravan to connect with Native Montanans, Steve Gluckert primarily, who gave me stories about things that were quite a bit more obscure. I didn't know anything about some of the incidents that he brought up, and it made me realize that if I went down into a deeper level of local history, that there was some really fascinating material. And so, I waited 20 years for very good reasons. And now picking it up, that's what's happened, is that I've had an opportunity to look at more obscure or perhaps subtle events, which, and I think that's actually a reflection of the whole trend with history, because when I was in high school in the 60s, history in high school was incredibly boring. It was just memorize this general, memorize this date, money and expansion. It was horrible. Actually, I couldn't stand it. And by the time my daughter was in high school, which was in the early 90s and late 80s, and she would study in our kitchen, and by studying, she had like a photographic memory, so she would read out the part of the text that she had, and then she would remember all the information for her exams, and I'd be in the kitchen making dinner, and so I got to hear what they were writing about history at that time, and it was fascinating. I went, okay, it's not that history is boring, it's that what they were teaching or emphasizing at this other time had no interest for me, no interest. It was all these big, horrible events, kind of reflective of what's going on now. And that if you got down into like, well, somebody forgot to send a telegram, and because they forgot to send that telegram, this war occurred, or because somebody made a typo in something. Actually, Citizens United, this whole thing about allowing corporations to exist as people and having voting rights, that was an error. Anyway, I didn't know anything about it until I was in this situation where I was hearing this kind of more personal data, or what were the women doing during a siege, or how were the indentured servants and the slaves, what was their life like? Anyway, so I brought that kind of perspective more to bear on the more recent paintings. But this, in fact, is from the earlier paintings. This is 20 years old, and it's a detail of one of the Peepshows, which we will go visit soon. I did a big painting of the Jack Dempsey, Tommy Gibbons fight in Shelby, which actually it's kind of a cross one, because it wasn't like anything that people really think about too much now. But it was kind of unusual enough, and I was taking the train in the 80s and 90s. I was taking the train from Shelby to the New York area, and I think because I was interested in Shelby, I found out that there had been this prize fight there. And so, you can find it in Wikipedia, and the encyclopedia was nationally important, but it still kind of runs into the obscure. So I have a very detailed painting that I'll talk to you about a little bit, but this is the only painting that exists that is not in a Peepshow box, and I painted it specifically to offer up at the art auction for the museum in 1995. So it's in a private collection. But it's kind of good because you don't have to look in there. Anyway, it's Jack Dempsey shaking hands with Tommy Gibbons, who was his opponent, and then the Queen's in there kind of arbitrating. So this red box is actually the painting of Jack Dempsey and Tommy Gibbons slugging it out in the ring in Shelby, and it's a really fascinating story, which I won't go into all the details because it's like a 15-minute long story, but basically there was this prize fight that occurred in Shelby that was like a pipe dream. Like all these people thought they were going to get rich, that hundreds and thousands of people would come from all over the US on the newly installed train lines that ran transcontinental. And so they picked Shelby because the banks all invested in it, and the long run is they lost money. Shelby never really recovered from it. It was like their glory day. They built this stadium to accommodate all these people. The ticket price was really, really high. And what happened is, I think it was the Northern Pacific Railroad was going to help promote that people come from these other places to see the thing. And they got cold feet, and so they stopped promoting it. Not that, I think people probably still came in by train, but they didn't make a big effort with it. And so what happened is the stadium was barely occupied. On the surrounding hillside, there were apparently crowds of people that had come by wagon or foot or horse from the surrounding communities who obviously didn't have the ticket price, but they sat and watched it for free outside of the ring or outside of the fence line. And then in terms of the fighters, so Jack Dempsey was really famous at that time. I think he was the heavyweight or the lightweight, I'm not sure which, one of those champions. And they deliberately picked somebody that he would obviously not have a big problem with, although the guy that they picked, Tommy Gibbons, was pretty skillful. So I think it was actually a really good match. And Charlie Russell was one of the paying people in the audience. And if you look, he's kind of over on the left in the seats. And anyway, I just had fun. I'm not really somebody that is a boxing fan, so it's kind of uncharacteristic for me, but I did use archival photos of the fight that I found in Helena at the Historic Society. So that was kind of where I got the material. And I knew that Dempsey actually had on like a light-colored, shiny boxing shorts, so I tried to incorporate that in there. Anyway, it was kind of fun. And Dempsey left secretly with as much of the prize money as he could retain. And then the citizens of Shelby, especially the bankers, woke up and it's like pretty bad. Yeah, it was pretty bad. But it's, I like the fact that it happened. And it's an interesting story. And Tommy Gibbons, who was from like Minnesota or Wisconsin, one of the northern middle states, he liked Montana so much that I think he ended up coming back repeatedly, even though he didn't end up with any money. He had good feelings about Montana. So this one is, it's the 25th Infantry Bicycle Brigade, and that happened in the late 1890s in the Missoula area. It was out at Fort Missoula. It was, again, I'm using kind of a broad brush, but basically, one of the military guys decided his secret weapon would be using black soldiers, sort of in the aftermath of the Civil War, to train them to use bicycles to get from one place to the other. I mean, in retrospect, it seems really kind of unwieldy, but he had this group of very fit, handsome soldiers that he worked with to educate them on how to, you know, ride long distances, and he got some kind of a grant or funding to do it. So there are existing photographs of him with his soldiers, and they famously rode from Missoula down to Yellowstone Park. There's a really beautiful photograph of the soldiers with their bicycle and all their gear, like posed around the Mammoth Hot Springs, or like one of the big natural phenomena. And then their kind of the height of their abilities was that they went from Montana to St. Louis on their bicycles. I think it was one way, but it had to have been extremely arduous because these are not bikes like these are not like mountain bikes like what we could use now to go long distances. I mean, there is a replica of one of the bikes out at the Fort Missoula Historical Society that I went to look at and draw so that I could replicate it. But in any case, they kind of evaporated because they were gaining momentum at the time. I think the Spanish-American War occurred in the, in the Caribbean, and all the country's resources and attention and focus went into that. And so it was kind of like a short-lived phenomena. I don't know what happened to the soldiers, but there are photographs of them in different configurations. And I used a really bad photograph that I discovered to give me the idea for this, because some of the good photographs have been reproduced quite a bit, because 25 years ago when I heard about them for the first time, there wasn't much material. But in the past 25 years, there have been books written about them, and they're included in local history more. But I found a photograph that was so damaged that it's not been used in any of these publications. But I love the composition, which is that you have this line of the soldiers headed by their commander, with all their bikes in formation in profile. And so I sort of took liberty with that. So I felt lucky that I could use an image that hadn't been used over and over again. So this one is titled "The Queen Elizabeth I Attends a Stump Speech by Theodore Roosevelt in Missoula in 1912. And when I did the research, I found out that Roosevelt actually came through Missoula twice during that period of time, separated by a year. So he must, I think it was, I can't remember exactly, I think he'd already been president and he was trying to move back into the political arena. And it was interesting, so I used the University of Montana's photo archives for inspiration, because it turned out he was in a couple of locations, and he was photographed. He was photographed at the train station on a horse, which is a really nice image. I'm not a horse person, and not a painter of horses. And then there was a few photographs of him on the balcony of the building that is on the southeast corner of Broadway and Higgins. It's still there. It's a bank building. It was a bank building at that time, and so because he was there, they had decorated the building with lots and lots of flag material, like wrapping it, and stars and bunting, and people are holding flags. And it must have been the fall, because everybody's in coats. It looks kind of cold and gray. But what was fascinating about the crowd photo, because the photographer was way back shooting towards this assembly of dignitaries, including Roosevelt, is that the crowd, which this is the part I thought was amazing. There's like hundreds of people watching Roosevelt. 99% are men, like without exception. They're all, they've all got their hats, they've got their gray coats and brown coats, and everybody's dressed very similarly. They're all white, and there's like one or two women. And the fascinating thing is, in the photographs, they're all looking at Roosevelt. He's looking towards the photographer. The people are looking at him, so they've got their backs to the photographer. But the very few women that are in the photograph are looking at the photographer. So I decided to honor that because I just thought it was kind of fascinating that maybe the women were there, maybe it was the wife of the photographer and she was looking at her husband. I don't know what the deal was, but it made it really clear that they were women because the clothing is pretty somber. Anyway, I got her on the balcony, and that was a very difficult painting to paint because I was painting the building that they were using as their platform, and it's all these linear bricks. And I find that if I have an organic subject like trees or flower beds or things that have a lot of curves and are natural settings, it's much easier to paint than things that are highly, highly linear and have a lot of rigid perspective lines. But this is a more recent painting, and I did want to do, this is kind of in that big category, like it would have made the front page of the paper. And in this instance, I wanted to do at least one event out of the newer 5 that was reflective of something like that it was a dignitary. But it was difficult, yeah. This is in the mid-1950s, and this is again one of the ones that was inspired by the Missoula area. I don't know how I found out about it, because I actually think maybe they actually have this parade every once in a while. I can't find any information about it on Google, so it's kind of frustrating, but somehow or another I became aware of what is called the Pet and Doll Parade, or the Pet and Toy Parade, which is a children's parade, usually in the summer. And I don't think it's every year, but obviously it was at least once in the 30s, and once in the 40s, and once in the 50s, maybe more frequently, but I'm only able to go by the photo documentation. So there was a pet and toy or a pet and doll parade that started out right around Higgins, where Warden's is, and then they probably went up Higgins. And there's really good photographs of the children in their costumes. They tended to wear costumes, and they would be holding like a rabbit or a dog or a toy, a doll. Anyway, the kids would dress in costumes that their parents obviously helped them with. The costumes that they wore in the 1950s are especially charming. It's like Peter Pan or a princess or whatever. So I used the photographs very heavily for inspiration and used several different photos and kind of put things together. But one of the best parts was that my daughter and one of her best friends were kids during the early 80s, and they used to get together and put on all sorts of elaborate clothing, and we had these antique baby carriages, and they would put their cats into the antique baby carriages and then stroll around the block in high heels and dresses. So I just went, okay, artistic license, I am inserting Indigo and Helen from the 1981 into the 1950s, and so that was kind of fun for me because I'm going, their clothing's a little bit out of context, but it's fun. And so if you look at it, you will see buildings that you probably recognize slightly changed, but like the Missoula textile is in there, and I've got the Queen as kind of an insignificant figure on the sidewalk. So she's watching the parade, but she is not the focal point. So I've kind of enjoyed sometimes some of the paintings she's like really front and center, and other ones she's just part of the crowd. And that's been an opportunity for me. And then this is, I think it's the last one I'm going to talk about. It is the Sacagawea and Clark. So this is the first time, at least of this series, where the Queen has visited Montana. It's in 1804 or 1802. She intercepted Clark and Sacagawea when they were in the Lolo area. And again, I did this one 20 years ago, and it's kind of interesting because now you can go to a visitor's center to Travelers Rest and learn about their experience, not the Queen's, but Sacagawea and Lewis and Clark, coming through this area 200 years ago. But when I visited and wanted to do this painting over 20 years ago, that center didn't exist, or it was in the early formative stages. So I actually went out and did some detective work and tried to figure out where they were, where they had been, and I brought a sketch pad and a camera and stuff like that. But I did active sketching of the landscape to embed them in that, which had good consequences, which is that I had not really worked with outdoor drawing from nature or painting from nature prior to that time. And so in the years after the Caravan project, so like in 97, 98, I did a series of landscape paintings from the Missoula area and the Flathead Lake area that were very well received. So it kind of triggered something, but in any case, they're standing there and the Queen is visiting them. You know, they've all got their appropriate clothing. So this is a reminder that when I'm trying to give clues about where they are in time, the landscape is not going to do that. It's the man-made, so your clothing, which reflects the fashions of the time, or the structures like the buildings that are kind of evocative of a particular era. So that's been fascinating for me because I may have referred to that already, but I did painting for the art auction that is coming up in January, February, and I have the Queen all by herself. She doesn't have anyone else in the painting, but she is in a landscape. She's at Holland Lake on a hiking trail. And by doing that, you know, that could have been 500 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 50 minutes ago. I mean, the time of year would dictate something, but not the year that it occurs. So it's kind of fun to think about how do you know what time you're in, and what are those things that inform what your experience is being in that time.